Hi everyone, my name is James, and today I'm going to be building one of my favorite projects. This is a keepsake box. It is made of African Padauk and tiger maple. There will be a complete set of plans for this project in the description in case you're interested. Paducah is a fairly common exotic wood species. The trees grow very large and they're very wide, and many hardwood dealers will carry this. As I had said, keepsake boxes are one of my favorite things to build, and today I'm going to show you a really easy one to build. It might look fancy because it has through dovetail joinery, but it's actually pretty simple to do. There's really only about 10 pieces to build a box like this, and if you follow along step by step, you can see how it's done. I've started by ripping the sides down to width, and then jointing the edges, and here I am cross-cutting them to the correct length. If your boards aren't already all exactly the same thickness, then you're going to need to plane them down. The way to do that is to start by face jointing one side, and then you can put them in the planer to get the other side down parallel to that. The easiest way to make dovetails is to make sure that all four sides are the exact same thickness. So that's what I'm going to do here. Face joint these down, then run them through the planer with calipers to make sure I get them all four exactly to 3/4 of an inch. When we put them in the dovetail jig, the first thing we do is make sure that the board is centered in the jig from left to right between two fingers. And the tails are always cut first on dovetails. And if anybody out there has a Porter cable jig and they're not 100% sure how to cut through dovetails, I am going to have a very comprehensive tutorial on exactly how to make a through dovetail joint on my very next project, the one that follows this, and that should be up in about 4 days, I think. At this point, the tails are done, so we'll make some changes and we will cut the pin boards. The pin boards are cut with a straight cutter, and the dovetails are cut with the dovetail shape cutting bit. So that will conclude the cutting of the pin board. You can see there's a backer behind there to prevent tear out on the back side. Here, as with all exotics, it's a good idea to use a little bit of acetone and wipe down the surfaces that you are about to glue. Doing this will prevent the oils, whatever oils may have accumulated on the surface, from interfering with the glue bond. You'll get a much stronger bond and hopefully a joint that will last a lifetime. And we'll do a test fit at this point. So it all looks good at this point, so we can move on to the glue up stage. I like to put some tape down on the inside of the joints, which will help me with some cleanup later. If you've seen any of my other videos, you know that I like to overglue my projects. At this point, it's easy. You just put glue, and some more glue. And as soon as you've finished putting all the glue on, you put glue just one more time. In 30 years of woodworking, I have never had a joint fail because it didn't have good glue coverage, and I don't mind cleaning up the excess glue afterward. Now, of course, all my kids make fun of me for it and tell me Titebond should sponsor me. And the only thing that I like as much as glue are clamps. I think you can never have too many clamps for any given project. Typically, the rule of thumb for me is put as many clamps on there as you can fit. It's a good idea at this point to clean some of the excess glue off if you can with a damp rag. It will make sanding the outer surface later just a little bit easier. Now to cut the top of the box. If you've ever seen a cabinet door, they have a rail and stile type of construction, and I'm using something almost exactly the same as that. I'm going to have a raised panel in the middle and then 4 rails that wrap around it. And here, while a specific thickness is not necessary, it is important to have them all taken down to the same thickness. If you have a router table, you can get a rail and stile bit cutting set. Some of those come with a raised panel door cutting bit as well. If the diameter of the cutters for the profile that you choose isn't too big, you can just cut these on a handheld router. This cutting set happens to be shaker style. A miter sled comes in handy for cutting the 4 corners of this at 45 degrees to create the box top. But I have done a handful of keepsake boxes in my life using nothing more than a back saw and a little plastic miter box. Tape is the perfect assembly tool for this type of a project. It'll help us to see if we've developed something that's perfectly square, and it will also work as a clamp to hold the pieces together a little bit until they start to dry. It looks like we've lucked out there with 4 pieces that come together nicely, and so we're going to move on and cut the raised panel for the inside. This is the tiger maple, which I think has a beautiful contrast with the paducah. So this is the raised panel cutter. This is a router bit that cannot be used on a handheld router because, as you can see, it cuts a profile on both sides of the wood. The bottom part that's cutting the red part is cutting the front or top profile. That's going to be the top of the box, and the other part is the back cutter. That's narrowing our piece down and gives it a little more of a 3D effect from the inside and the outside. You could conceivably choose a raised panel cutter that does not have a back cutter on it, one that might operate in a handheld router, but you'll need to use caution with the size of the router bit you use and the power of the router that you have. Here I have it set in the clamps and ready to be glued. I won't be using a biscuit or any other type of joinery for the corners of this miter frame because the whole entire top of this is going to glue flat onto our box. So it's going to be very strong when we're all done. You can notice there that I am not actually putting any glue into the raised panel. I want the raised panel to be able to float, to be able to wiggle around for any expansion and contraction that might occur. After it's dry, a good sanding will touch up those corners and make them look perfect. It is important to note that this is the top of the box and I can use this sander on it, but for the bottom of the box and even the bottom side of this, I'm going to have to use a big flat sanding block like this. It's important that the pieces be perfectly flat so that they mate perfectly together for joining. Now before I glue that top on, I am going to put a rabbet in the bottom of this so that I can recess the bottom of the keepsake box up into the sides. This is a 3/8 inch rabbeting bit, and I'm kind of going around the whole inside edge, just barely scoring it, maybe cutting half the depth, and then I'll go around a second pass and move it to full depth. I did use gloves because the top corner is sharp, but my hands are nowhere near the cutter, and I don't recommend gloves for any other type of operation. Now, since the top has been sanded perfectly flat and mated to the lid, or the top of the box rather, we are going to glue those together. When I designed this box top here, I designed it to be about a 1/16 of an inch bigger than the base, so I have a little bit of wiggle room when I clamp it down in case it shifts a little off one way or the other, and we'll just sand that flush after it's all dried. If we've done a good job of sanding the box itself and the bottom side of this lid flat, then once it's all glued up and we sand it, we won't see a seam line. That's one of the reasons for the big sanding block. Lots of clamps here, then we're going to let this dry thoroughly overnight. I didn't show it on camera, but I did clean all of the surfaces with acetone before they were glued. And I am going to take just a minute, use a damp rag, and try to get all of the glue that came out on the inside off. It's so much easier to take it off now with a damp rag than it is to sand it off later. Okay, now we've got to get those dovetails down flush and the lid, the box top there, down flush as well. The best way to do this is with a belt sander, and I actually start with 36 grit. After a bit, I switch to 50 grit, and then after a little bit more, I'll switch to 60 grit with my random orbit sander. The outside of this box is extremely easy to sand if you just let the sander do the work for you. A lot of people like to start with a grit that's too fine. I start with a really coarse grit, and in just minutes it takes it down to where it needs to be, and then I can use the finer grits to get out those bigger scratches. You'll be able to see when the sanding is done here that the seams are virtually invisible. I guess it seems like I'm showing a lot of sanding, but in all honesty, I sanded the whole outside of this box all the way from 36 grit down to 220 grit in probably 10 to 12 minutes. A super easy way to dress up this top is put a little bevel on my saw and just cut the corners off all the way around. This really makes it look elegant. And I think that looks a lot nicer. And now it's going to be time to go ahead and cut the lid off. There's a few ways to do this. Some people can do it on a table saw. You just cut all the way around. I just choose to do it on a bandsaw because I have one. The key is just to go very slow. I pick a spot maybe a couple of inches down from the top to give the top a little bit of depth, and maybe try to cut right between a dovetail. And that gives it a nice finished look when it's all done. So I think those proportions look really good. Now it's important to take that box back over to the sander, and we have to use our sanding block here again, and we want to get it perfectly flat. The bandsaw leaves the cut a little bit rough, and we want it to be mated absolutely perfectly because we want that seam line to disappear when the box is closed. And hopefully when we're done it looks something like this. Okay, the last part of the box is going to be the bottom. Now I did have one piece of the tiger maple left. Unfortunately it wasn't wide enough for the bottom. And so I built another box like this as well. I had the idea of maybe just putting a little piece of paducah in the middle between the two boards of maple at the bottom. So I take the maple piece, I cut it off center, I insert the paducah in it, and that sort of gives me the wider width that I need for the bottom and gives a little element of design to it as well. So we'll need to joint up all those edges, make them nice and flat, and then go ahead and glue them up. Don't forget to use acetone, again, to clean up the edges of any exotic woods before you glue. Once it's dry, we can take it out of the clamps. Then we're going to need to plane it down. I have cut the rabbet depth at about 1/2 inch. So it's a 3/8 inch wide rabbet, and it's about 1/2 inch deep. So I'm going to have to run this through the jointer after I get the glue off here and get it down to a total thickness of about 1/2 inch. And I'm going to go ahead and try to cross cut it to the exact size. And then I'm going to rip it to the exact width. It's pretty important here to remember the old adage, always measure twice and cut once. I already had to expand this bottom piece to get it to fit, so I don't want to cut it down too narrow now and have to figure something else out. Next, I'm going to just give it a little test fit and see if my width and length are just right. It looks like they are. Notice it's not going to fit in because my router left round corners and my box has square. So I'm going to place the bottom part here underneath the box and trace those rounded corners on it so that I can sand them round. Just take your time. You can use a hand sander, a disc sander if you have it. It's fine. It's pretty aggressive, so you'll want to go slow. And just try to sand it very slowly and carefully right up exactly to the line. It might take a couple of tries and test fits to get it perfect, but it's not too hard. And so now this fit pretty good, but if for any reason it didn't, you would never know because from the top, your board is hidden in a rabbet and you have actually room for a whole lot of error. Not many people are going to turn your box over to see if there are minor gaps on the bottom, but from the inside, it's always going to be perfect. So here I am using a dye. This is a trans tint dye. This is going to absorb into the parts of the grain that have the striping, and I'm going to sand off the rest of it. This is one of the ways to make the tiger maple really stand out. And here I'm just going to try to sand most of it off, but it's still going to be in deep in the striped parts, and that's really going to show later when we put our lacquer finish on. And now we get to put the last piece of our box together. I once again did pre-clean it with acetone since we are gluing to an exotic. And make sure you over-glue it. That's important. Always put more glue than you think you need. And when you're done, put even a little bit more. We're going to clamp this and let this set up overnight to dry as well. When you get to this stage in your project, you really need to use something with soft feet on your clamps and be concerned about your clamping pressure. We don't want to damage any surfaces. And then take a moment to, once again, clean all the excess glue out of the inside. I'm using a hidden hinge, and what I have in my router table here is a 1/2 inch spiral cutter, and it's going to cut slots for me to insert my hinges into. Depending on which hinges that you get, there will be detailed instructions telling you the exact width and depth of whatever slots you need for the hinges to fit perfectly. I'm using a VIX bit. It's a self-centering drill bit to put the holes in for the screws to go into. It keeps the screws centered perfectly in the hinge so they go in straight and don't try to move the hinge one way or another. Then another little trick is to use just a little bit of paste wax on your screws. This will help them go all the way in quickly and easily with very little friction, and it greatly reduces the chance of a screw breaking on you. If you choose to use a screw gun at this point, it's important not to put too much torque and just get the screw almost all the way to the bottom. And once that's done, you can use a handheld screwdriver to tighten it up the rest of the way. It'd be very bad to break a screw off in here at this point. And that's pretty much it. Our box is complete at this point. If you look close, you can see the seam lines are very hard to detect. So I'm going to finish mine with lacquer. Lacquer is one of my favorite finishes. But a quick note about paducah. Paducah is a very oily wood, and it's really important to take a moment to clean the outside surface of the paducah after you have finished sanding it really well with acetone. The acetone is going to take the oils off the surface, and any finish that you use is going to bond right away to it. Oil finishes are generally a bad idea for paducah. Oil finishes that dry are a bad idea for paducah. And even many polyurethanes can take a very long time to dry because the oils continue to come out of the paducah. Because lacquer dries so fast, it makes a fantastic finish for this wood. You might be able to notice some of the tiger striping in the maple is coming out nicely. And what I've done is I've given the box 3 coats of lacquer, and between the coats of lacquer I have sanded by hand with 1000 grit paper, and when you're done it gives a finish that's just glass smooth. I will try to put links for the lacquer that I used, the hinges that I used, some of the router bits, things like that in the description in case anybody is interested. And I also have a complete set of plans for this. There should be a link in the description shortly. And on my website, there's also a complete set of plans for everything that I build in case anyone is interested in that. A little bit of tack cloth wipes the final bit of the sanding dust off, and our box is complete.